Okay, so I've got a little bit of a discussion about this article that came through NPR News this morning at 5 a.m. And it is a big, long, investigative type of deal. You can see how huge this item is. It's very big. And it interviews a lot of people. It's a classic environmental journalism kind of piece. And it's about the A word, asbestos. And they inhaled asbestos for decades on the job. Now workers break their silence. That's a great headline, right? So this might surprise a lot of people. And they allude to this, that asbestos is not 100% banned. It is not necessarily, the government basically did not say that every single use of asbestos is no longer permitted. The reality of it is that when you have something that's so embedded in the world and the uses in industry and in all sorts of applications like asbestos was, you can't just overnight ban it. That's not possible. And we're talking about this 40, 50 years after the real big breakthroughs were made to realize that asbestos has serious hazards to our health. But this article basically focuses in on one single industry that still has some applications for asbestos. And it's an industry that most people probably never even heard of, even though we do use their products or some derivative of their products every single day. So go to your kitchen sink, open the cabinet underneath the sink. Do you see a bottle of bleach, a bottle of Clorox, a bottle of chlorine bleach? Right? So that's the classic product of this industry that that I'm going to bring up. But it's not the only one. So how about this thing right here? Likewise, open your kitchen sink cabinet and look at the drain coming off your sink. What color is it? Is it white like this? Does it look a little bit like that? This is PVC, polyvinyl chloride. Do you have vinyl records that you listen to? That's the same material as this, it's just colored black. Vinyl, PVC, polyvinyl chloride contains chlorine in its molecular structure. Out of this piece of PVC, whether it's a record or whether it's a pipe, a little over half of the weight is actually chlorine atoms. Those chlorine atoms, where did they come from? So anybody who remembers chemistry, took it, knows that chlorine isn't something you just go outside and, oh, we're going to dig a hole and we're going to find a spring of chlorine coming up out of the ground. That does not exist because chlorine is so highly reactive that it tends to want to make friends with other elements, like sodium being one of the most common. Sodium and chlorine are NaCl, which is salt. So the oceans are full of salt. About 3% of seawater by weight is salt. So what these guys do here in this industry is they take salt water usually from the ocean or from an artificial source or from a well or from a lake or some source of salt water, and they run electricity through it, and they break the chlorine and the sodium away from each other and separate them so that we can use them to do things like make bleach, make PVC, make lye, make caustic soda, make soap, make various chemical products that involve the use of those items. And that industry is, when you really think about it, extremely, extremely important in all sorts of ways. I got some tap water here. This tap water was disinfected with chlorine gas, right? To eliminate bacteria that might be in the water. We have electronics that we're using here. There are microprocessor chips inside of these electronics where etching is done using chlorine gas. So when we etch metals in the semiconductor industry, we usually use a chlorine-containing plasma to scrub metals off of a surface in order to make a pattern. So it's used in absolutely everything. So in the chlor-alkali industry, as it's called, there are basically two modern processes that are used, but there's three total processes. One of them is basically historic curiosity value at this point. So the historic process is called the mercury cell. You can obviously go look up what it is. I'm not going to get into much detail, but it's a really innovative thing. Whoever came up with it, very smart people. Okay, very intelligent engineering type people that did this mercury cell. The problem with it, though, is that it ends up releasing small quantities of mercury containing wastewater, and that's a big problem. That's actually a bigger problem than the asbestos issue. So mercury cells have been outmoded. Now we have what are called diaphragm cells and membrane cells. And when I say the word cell, you can think of this like a battery cell. So you got batteries like double A's or whatever. Those are electrolytic cells, except that these cells work in the opposite direction of a battery cell. Batteries convert chemical energy into electrical energy, whereas these cells convert electrical energy into chemical energy. So a chemical like salt, you can think of it like the ashes of a fire. So you burn wood and you create ashes. Can you take the ashes and burn them again and get more energy? No, that's a well-known fact. That reaction is irreversible. You can't get more energy from something that's already been combusted. Likewise, salt is the same way. You take chlorine. If I have a balloon full of chlorine gas and a little pellet of sodium over here, and I put them together in a container, and I light the sodium on fire, I might not even have to do that. It might happen spontaneously. They will burn with a bright flame, and you will get salt. And that's it. And the salt will be left there as a little residue in the bottom of the container, and you're done. In order to get that salt converted back into chlorine or back into sodium, you have to apply energy to it. You have to apply at least the amount of energy that was released when the sodium and the chlorine burned to make the salt. And these chlor-alkali plants do that. They get their energy in the form of electricity. So NPR went to Niagara Falls, New York. What's so special about Niagara Falls is they have lots and lots of electricity from the falls. So whenever you look at Niagara Falls, when you see the water going over the falls, that's only like a third, at least during they vary the flow, but it's like a third of the natural flow of water actually going over Niagara Falls. At least I think that's the number I remember. The rest of the water goes through hydropower plants and makes electricity. They make many gigawatts of electricity, and we're talking enough power to run large cities. Is generated at Niagara Falls. So you probably have enough power to run a city of 3 or 4 million people from the falls. But a lot of the electricity historically went to industry because hydropower is very cheap and there's a lot of it right there. So companies came in over the decades and they built these plants that need lots of power. One of them is currently OxyChem, so Occidental Chemical, OXY, and they have a plant that produces chlorine and caustic soda, aka chlor-alkali, chlorine and alkalis. So caustic soda is typically referred to as sodium hydroxide chemically, or a lye, or if you use potassium instead of sodium, it's caustic potash, or also called lye. And those chemicals are very, very important, both from the chlorine side of things and the caustic side of things. So these plants are making this stuff. Now at OxyChem in Niagara Falls, they're using what's called the diaphragm process. So how does this work? So we're going to go to this website here. This is a European trade group for chlor-alkali industry. They have some little YouTube animations of how the cells work. We're going to look at the diaphragm cell. So here it is. We'll make this bigger. Okay. So they're showing the cell coming together, filling up with an aqueous solution of water and salt. So everything kind of come up here. All right, so here it is. Basically, you've got this box with something down the middle, and they're calling it the permeable diaphragm. This diaphragm allows brine, which is the fancy word for salt water, and sodium ions to pass through it, and they go towards the right. So on the left side of this box, we've got an anode, the electrical positive electrode here. Then on the right side, we have the cathode, the negative electrode. So there's a direct current DC power supply connected between these. The power supply gets electricity from the grid from Niagara Falls, converts it to DC, and runs these cells. We're pushing thousands and thousands of amps of current through these cells. The electric current goes through the salt water, and the chlorine atoms are attracted to the, or chloride ions, I should say, that are in the salt water are attracted to the left, to the anode side of things. And the electricity basically breaks those away from the salt and says, you're coming with me, and it makes chlorine gas. So instead of sodium chloride, you've got chlorine gas, Cl2. So you get two chloride ions that kind of link up together. It becomes the elemental gas, and that bubbles through the liquid, and it leaves through the top of the cell as a gas. The sodium ions are now without a friend. Oh, what am I going to do? I don't have, my friend is gone, my chloride. The electricity over here is just calling its name. Negative charge, come here. And it attracts the sodium ions, and they shoot themselves through the permeable diaphragm, and they land on the cathode. And now I'm no longer a sodium ion, I'm a sodium atom, because the electricity, ultimately powered by Niagara Falls or wherever, gave that sodium an extra electron. He's got his one missing electron back. He feels whole again. But sodium is so reactive, it can't go long without having a friend. So it's like, oh, I need somebody. And it snatches up something from the water, the oxygen and the hydrogen that's in the water, becomes a very attractive candidate for this sodium. And it reacts with the water just like it did when you threw the sodium pellet into the water in chemistry class and it went crazy. It kind of does the same thing here, and it grabs a hold of the water molecule, it takes the hydrogen and the oxygen, and then it throws the other hydrogen away and says, I don't want this many hydrogens, and then basically they bubble up through here as a gas. Because a hydroxide ion, or OH minus, has an extra electron, and the sodium needs an extra electron. So they work well together. So that extra hydrogen kind of just says, well, screw you guys, I'm leaving. And it goes through the water, and it bubbles up through the top of the cathode compartment, and it goes off to the rest of the plant, and they can utilize that hydrogen for various processes. The chlorine, of course, does the same thing on the positive side. Leaving the cell, we've got diluted caustic soda and diluted brine, salt water. They can take that solution and send it off to a still and distill it and evaporate off various components and make higher concentrations of sodium hydroxide and salt. So this is the diaphragm cell. So what's this special thing in the middle? It's very important with this cell that you don't allow the solutions to just slosh around and mix with each other, because then you're going to end up where you're going to reduce the efficiency of the process, and you're going to have a hard time getting a high concentration of sodium hydroxide, of caustic soda, on the cathode side of the cell. So they put this thing in here. It's made out of asbestos. Why asbestos? Well, asbestos is resistant to chlorine, it's resistant to sodium ions, it's resistant to salt, it's resistant to caustic soda, and it doesn't dissolve in water, and it's just all in all basically indestructible in this process. So it's a really good material, and it allows them to basically build this diaphragm such that the sodium ions and the salt can go through the diaphragm as required, but you keep a level of separation between the two sides, so you're not just digging holes and filling them back in again in a sort of sense that you would be if you didn't have this here. So that's the diaphragm cell made with asbestos, and that's what they were running at OxyChem in Niagara Falls. So all these people that they interviewed here worked at that facility and went through their stories about asbestos. You can obviously look this up yourself and read it, but you know, I'm not going to spend all this time on it. The other thing is, well, isn't there an alternative to that? Now, when you do read this, they say in here, well, you know, there is technology available that allows us to make chlorine and sodium hydroxide without asbestos. But these guys chose not to use it. And you get this sort of classic anti-industry language, like they chose to lobby for looser regulations than to upgrade the plants. Okay, so it's easy to make industry into a punching bag. That's just classic kind of human behavior. But what's going on here from a financial and a industry standpoint is that it's a decision-making process that almost everybody goes through. So these facilities are very expensive to construct and to operate. And I always view this sort of decision-making process, there's a lot of short-sightedness in industry. It's kind of like various types of people in the world. Some people buy new cars every two years, and they spend a lot of money on buying new cars and trading in cars and all that good stuff. And you might look at that, well, that's wasteful. Okay, well, the other side of the coin is those people never have to worry about their car breaking down because they always have a good, reliable vehicle. And they probably have lower operating costs because the fuel efficiency of the newer cars is better than their older stuff. So that's one way to look at it. The other side of the coin is, okay, we've got people who drive their cars till the wheels fall off. All right, and then when the wheels fall off, they put the wheels back on and they keep driving it. Okay, they never have car payments and they are always proud of that, but they run the risk of running into mechanical problems as the vehicle ages. They run into issues with, just maintenance costs. So in industry, especially very heavy industry like this, they try to run the stuff until the wheels fall off. They try to run their capital investment until it's run into the ground, until they can get nothing else out of it. And it's always a decision that goes on between, okay, we can upgrade this thing, but it's going to have an ROI, a return on investment. Well, we can make an upgrade, but if the ROI period is not to our liking, we're not going to do it. And there's various reasons why, financial reasons, tax reasons, depreciation reasons, why industry would continue running old dinosaur technology instead of upgrading to the newest and greatest. So this case here, we have an alternative. We have new stuff that we could install that would not use asbestos. It would also be more energy efficient. And it would also make a higher quality product. And that process is called the membrane cell. So if we go back to here, let's see how the membrane cell works. Looks a lot similar, right? Same idea, same chemistry. There's one big difference between the membrane cell and the diaphragm cell. This wall between the cathode and the anode is a non-permeable ion exchange membrane made from some kind of a polymer, probably a fluoropolymer or something like that. It does not contain asbestos. It actually doesn't really contain any hazardous materials in and of itself. But the only thing that's allowed through this membrane is sodium ions. Sodium ions can puncture their way through there because they're tiny, whereas the water molecules and the chlorines and that stuff doesn't go through the membrane. So that allows them to keep better separation between the two sides of the cell. The result of that is you get higher purity caustic soda, saying you don't have salt in high concentrations dissolved with the caustic soda. So the diaphragm cell, you might get sodium hydroxide solution with a few % of sodium chloride still dissolved in it. And if you want higher purity, you got to then downstream, you've got to separate out the salt. But this cell, the salt concentration over here on the cathode is very low. It's parts per million levels. You can get very, very low salt concentrations. It makes a higher quality caustic. And then you can just take that 30% caustic or 32% caustic and evaporate off the water and make whatever concentration of caustic soda you need, all the way up to solid sodium hydroxide. So that's the membrane cell. This cell is more energy efficient. You have less kind of competing side reactions going on inside of here. It allows you to use less electricity to make the same amount of chlorine and the same amount of caustic. But, what's the but? These cells cost a lot of money to purchase them and install them. So if you have a plant that's working, that's making product that you can sell, and that there's a market for, why would you throw it away and make a new one? That's sort of the mentality that they have with these diaphragm plants, these asbestos-based cells. Because we have an investment made, it's basically depreciated, it's paid for. Why would we demolish it and install something new? Why would we change what we're doing? And they do a calculation. Okay, this membrane cell uses less energy than the diaphragm cell. Okay, well, let's see what it would take, how long it would take to pay back, the classic term, pay back our investment with energy. And when you're at Niagara Falls and you're getting hydropower for 2 cents a kilowatt hour or whatever it is, that's going to be a challenge, because these investments are millions and millions and millions of dollars to change these cells. So if they have a 5, 10, 15-year return on investment period for going to membrane cells, they're just going to buy more electricity and just keep using the diaphragm cells, especially if the market supports it. If the market demand, if they're able to be competitive selling chlorine from a diaphragm plant versus a membrane plant, they're just going to keep running the diaphragm plant. Why build a new house when you already have one that's perfectly fine? Why take out another mortgage? So that's the mentality that's going on in industry with this kind of thing. So we talk about the asbestos. Well, what about the safety issues of the employees? All right, well, let's just be realistic about it. They went through, this was back in, these decisions were made back in the 80s and 90s. And the mentality back then is we can manage the risk of the asbestos. We can handle that. This is a controlled industrial facility. We can put procedures in place, administrative controls in place to keep people safe. Okay. have worked in industrial safety, and I know that there's 3 levels of controls. There's administrative controls, there's procedural controls, and there's engineering controls. And with human beings, the only one of those controls that I have any faith in, especially when something is being done in an occupational setting, is engineering controls. The other 2 are effectively worthless for routine jobs. They work okay when you have to do something one time, or one-off jobs. All right, we're going to use an administrative control or a procedural control. We're going to wear a respirator. All right. Wearing respirators every single day for normal work is not effective. It is very, very difficult to get good control with a respirator on a continuous, consistent basis. And the respirator regulations here in the United States require all these fit tests, they require medical evaluations, they require various things and all sorts of requirements that somebody has to do to select the proper respirator and ensure that it's being maintained. And you're going to tell Joe out on the floor at the plant, hey, you got to do all of this. He doesn't want to worry about any of that. He just wants to do his job. Okay? And he's going to throw that respirator on and work. And asbestos doesn't have a smell, it doesn't have a taste. You can't really see it unless it's present in large quantities. Administrative and procedural controls are not good. But back in those days, in the transitioning of industry from old school sort of pre-occupational health days to the modern era, people just kind of took administrative control. Well, we can do this just in the interim so we don't have to make these big investments and kill the economy and, the classic story. Oh my God, we're going to destroy the economy with all these regulations. Well, the fact of the matter is there's transition periods with everything. And what looks like continued for many decades is just because, well, we have something that works. We don't want to spend the money on upgrading it. We're making money off this plant. And that's the way it is. So that's kind of the approach. And it isn't just Oxy. It isn't just the chlor-alkali industry. Every company in every industry did the same thing, and in some cases continues to do the same thing. All right. Eventually, it's going to get to the point, though, where energy costs, maintenance costs, and various other costs, the market demands for caustic and for chlorine, are going to force this thing out of business. They're going to force them to the membrane process, which has lower salt concentrations, and the engineers are going to basically find ways to make it even cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, as they've done over the decades, and just run the thing into the ground in terms of the diaphragm asbestos-based chlor-alkali process, kind of like it did with the mercury cells. But they went back and they interviewed employees of this plant from way back into the 2000s, the 90s, and I hear this sort of anecdotal stuff all the time from people that have worked in heavy industry. all the people that work here, all the people that retired from here are all dying. Oh, they're all dying of cancer. Okay. The question I ask is, how old are they? Are they 70, 80, 90 years old? Okay. How many people out of the thousands that went through that plant actually dying of cancer at abnormal ages and abnormal numbers? That's the important question with all this kind of stuff. Is there an actual link to the workplace? And in many cases, there's not. Now, I'm not the one who did the journalism here, so I'm not going to say that that's the case here. But interviewing half a dozen people can give you some insight into how things were there. But certainly, it's important that you take it and see that it wasn't just one company. It wasn't just the chlor-alkali industry. It was everybody did things the same way. So that's just my response to this piece here, because they don't really seem to, I mean, they do explain how it works. It's just that it's so long and concentrates more on the asbestos side of it than the technology of making chlorine and caustic soda. So that's it.